I think people that have taken the time and effort to continue to write the story and the history of Annapolis provide a tremendous service. History is about the telling of a story and hopefully telling it accurately. That provides, a glimpse into the past and hopefully a future where the groundwork has been laid by that past.
I guess if we had any mission, it's to develop a more accurate history of Annapolis based on the original documents. That's why we're going to the state archives where the original documents are, or to the National Archives or other archives. So not just depending on secondary sources, but dealing with the primary sources, the original land records, deeds and wills and letters and ledgers and all the rich material that's there. It's hard to read. Some of it's very difficult to read because the old handwriting or the pages have deteriorated and so forth. But we persevere and do this kind of thing to get back to the original source.
The history of the Academy and the city has just been fascinating, and it's actually been such a wonderful relationship over the years since 1845. I remember Mrs. St. Clair Wright was always on me about doing exhibits on the subject, and how many brides Annapolis produced for the Navy, and with the influence of the Navy retirement community on Annapolis. And of course, she was a good example of that. My gosh, she did so much for the city, and a lot of people don't know that she was both a Navy junior. Her father was an admiral in the Navy and a graduate of the Naval Academy. And of course, her husband Joe was also a graduate of the Academy.
I work in a profession that's a real pleasure, just to be able to do this kind of work with this quality of an environment, in which to work, both the buildings and the people. And you hope that, the ultimate product of your work will be to encourage the same sort of interest in the future.
It was a living testament. When you say somebody researched something, we get somebody research this and look for that. But it was a way of life.
Our city has played host to the very founding fathers of our country. I mean, George Washington resigned his commission in our State House on December 23rd, 1783. Our State House was the home to Thomas Jefferson's office when he was the minister to France. The conference in Annapolis in 1786, which was the precursor to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Laid the groundwork for that Constitution, where Madison met with Alexander Hamilton, the two architects of the Constitution, wrote the Federalist Papers. They both walked through the State House of Annapolis, walked through the streets of Annapolis, went to pubs like Middleton's and others to share their camaraderie together. And you remember that as you walk through the streets of Annapolis, that you follow in the footsteps of a lot of the founding fathers of America.
Well, certainly the most interesting work that I've done, especially in the last 15 to 20 years, has been the work that has been ongoing at the Maryland State House. We first got involved on the State House in 1996 when the original Acorn was in poor condition, and something had to be done to protect the upper dome. And so that was a very interesting project, and really got me much more involved in the State House. And then we've had a whole series of projects since then dealing with the roof, structural issues, and most recently the current project there is the restoration of the old Senate chamber.
Oh my gosh, speak of national treasures, Jim Cheevers is just an amazing human being. I love asking him a question because I'll get such a rich answer. Any question, Jim, you can walk around the Naval Academy with Jim, and he can tell you about every brick of the Naval Academy, every piece of history. It's just fantastic. And so I love when I have a question on history. I'll ask Jim, and I'll get like a 1 or 2 page answer, but it's great. It's just, I would learn something every time I talk to Jim Cheevers. He's just such a treasure to walk around, and the knowledge of history of the city and the Naval Academy is just a delight to be around.
And I just know that I'm going to be meeting some fascinating people. I mean, I had an old math professor, lives over in Warder, he's 94 years old, still drives, been retired 31 years, and came in the other day, and I had to make him sit down because I wanted to listen to some of his stories about the Academy and also about Warder, where he lives, because it happens that he lived near where the former director of our museum, a guy named Harry A. Baldridge, had lived in the 1940s, and he knew the Baldridge house, and so I was fascinated to learn about that, because I deal with Admiral Baldridge's correspondence every day and his records on the museum and so forth. And he was quite a John Paul Jones scholar, by the way, Baldridge. And so I just know that I'm going to have fun. Some people, I'm sure, not everybody likes history. There are other people that like science and math and so forth. But if you love history, you can't help it, like working in a museum, a history museum, and learning all the time.
My interest has always been in the criminal justice corridor. That fascinated me.
Before George, there were no African American law enforcement officers in all of Anne Arundel County. And he came up with the special deputy sheriffs that took care of Cars Beach. They also, the mayor needed them. There was a game at Annapolis High School, and they thought there was going to be violence. The special deputy sheriffs were there. And that's another piece of his legacy that is important, because through him in training these men, the city of Annapolis finally hired African American officers, and they were once his special deputy sheriffs, also in Anne Arundel County. So this is a legacy that cannot be forgotten, and those that step into, fill those shoes should know how those doors open, and it was through George Phelps.
I think George brings a tremendous amount of history, particularly from his generation, like I say, with Joe Alton, Pitt Moyer, the riots that took place in Annapolis when Martin Luther King unfortunately was assassinated.
When you see something like a city like Annapolis just tying the city up, just tied up, where people that live here couldn't get to their homes.
George was the center of much of that, and a calming influence in the African American community, and a bridge builder to the white community at a time when we were going from segregation into integration in our school system and into our public facilities.
What I consider one of the most important jobs that my uncle has done in terms of history was the restoration and revitalization of the Brewers Hill Cemetery on West Street. I remember I was not too long out of college, and my uncle got a call from a mayor from the city of Annapolis who told him if the African American community does not clean up that cemetery, it will be a parking lot. So he took that burden on himself, the responsibility, the pride to do what was necessary to maintain and have African American history respected and recognized.
Certainly there's a great deal of sleuthing involved, and simply the sort of, the word that has become so popular is forensics, and building forensics is certainly a fascinating pursuit. And this is a great town to do it in.
George's mother's mother was a Maynard. The little that I've heard from my mother and my uncle is that they did spend time in this particular house. They also the Burges, and if I'm not mistaken, when George was looking into the family history, we have a connection with the Brewers, the Phelps and the Burges and the Reddys, if you look at the history, all having been slaves of Nicholas Brewer. So I don't know, they're probably related, probably cousins, but we are in fact Maynards. So when this house was closed, as you know, there are no African American homes open to the public, open to tourism in the city of Annapolis, and this has always been a goal of his. When Orlando Rideout IV saved the home, one of the people that was instrumental, working with Mr. Rideout was my Uncle George, and also Hilton Maynard, who lives here in town. And the goal is to make that home a place that people can understand the other story.
One of the things in our records that I want to straighten out when I get back to the office this afternoon, we supposedly have a letter from Admiral Lord Nelson to David Dixon Porter. Well, problem there is somebody made a mistake in the records, because Nelson would have had to have been clairvoyant to correspond to David Dixon Porter, because Nelson died in 1805 and young David Dixon wasn't born until 1813. So I don't think he wrote a letter to David Dixon Porter. I think they probably meant the father.
Sometimes we've been accused of being the history police of Annapolis, our group, because some of the information about Annapolis and that's maybe attractive to tourists and visitors is simply not true. We have a Treaty of Paris restaurant in Annapolis, and until fairly recent years there was a plaque in there that said after the Treaty of Paris was signed at the State House, the signatories came over and they celebrated here at the Maryland Inn. Well, if you stop to think, why is it called the Treaty of Paris? It wasn't signed in Annapolis, it was signed in Paris. But this keeps coming up, and it was ratified here. Now that's a major achievement. We think it's very cool that Annapolis was the U.S. capital of the United States, the peace capital of the nation. And yet this myth prevails, and I hear it every now and then, particularly from people who are fairly new to town, who are very excited about our history and our unique place in America. We started in 1992, so this is our 20th anniversary this year. And it's always been an informal group. There are no officers, there's no bylaws, there's no organization, there's no dues. The only time we ever collected money is back in the days before email, when we had to announce meetings with postcards. And we'd pass the hat once a year, and we had a little kitty for mailing postcards. So there's no real structure, except we meet once a month, and we either share information, present little research findings, or maybe we'll have a show and tell. Someone found an old book or an old ledger or something. Old photographs or typical old postcards.
You've mentioned the Annapolis History Consortium, and it really underscores that one of the real both advantages and pleasures of working in Annapolis and in the greater Chesapeake is that there's a real community of scholarship here. There's a long history of doing high quality work here by well-trained professional historians, and the newcomers like me when I was starting my career were immediately welcomed into that community and basically treated from the start as a full partner in the process. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to work with a community that thinks collaboratively.
You know, I was a nervous wreck in the early years, I can remember. And then I one day had the 4-star general of the Army, who was commander-in-chief of CONUS, all the Army in the United States or something like that. And I thought, oh my gosh. And I did pretty good. I did a pretty good tour for him, and he was so nice and so grateful and thank you. And I said, my God, if I can do that with this man, I can do it with anybody. So I've had some fascinating people that I've dealt with over the years, like Lady Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of England, Princess Alexandra, a first cousin to the Queen, and of course President Carter, who is a graduate of the Naval Academy, comes by to visit us every time he comes to Annapolis. He's good about coming to reunions and so forth, and he loves the museum. And we finally got him in there with one of his midshipman jumpers that he wore. We borrowed it from the Carter Library, and are very proud to boast that he's one of our 2 Nobel Prize winners, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002.
I've had a very enjoyable time working with Orlando, particularly in the preservation and renovation of the State House. I mean, obviously they're going through the process of renovating the old Senate chamber, and they went through the process of renovating the old House chamber and bringing it back to the time period of the 1860s, when they actually redid the Constitution of the state of Maryland. So Orlando Rideout has played a key role in the preservation of the city of Annapolis as well as the state of Maryland. And I think he brings great passion and pride to that, and a great deal of knowledge. And you know, it's been very, very informative to me. I've learned quite a bit from Orlando.
I would say one of the most rewarding things that I was able to work on was in 1998. We sponsored a conference here for the Vernacular Architecture Forum, which is a national group that studies buildings and landscapes. And in preparation, we spent 3 years preparing for the conference and producing a guidebook to the architecture of Annapolis. And so we sort of finally had to, in a systematic way, look at we probably looked at least 75 to 100 buildings across the city that we thought were the most important buildings for architectural historians to look at in detail.
Yes, sir, because the life was worth living. The life was worth living.